Hey guys, Naz here. Today I'm going to be taking you through how I digitise an embroidery file. I use the Bonita embroidery software suite. It's quite an expensive software, but because I use it professionally, I definitely think it is worth it. If you're in the market for an embroidery software and can fork out that kind of money, it's an absolutely flawless software and I always get perfect results with it. Really easy to use, lots of options, lots of different tools in the program itself. I've had a lot of people ask me how I digitise my files and just showed tips and tricks and things like that. Unfortunately, I only know how to use my own software. I've never used a different kind of software, so I can only show you how I do it within mine, but hopefully you'll get some tips that you can use in your own embroidery software. So I've already drawn the eyes that I'm going to be digitising today in Photoshop. You can draw them in any kind of software. You could draw them traditionally and scan them in, whatever you would like to do. So I've also included the pattern shape around that piece of embroidery because that's going to be important later when we do some of our stitches. I made a tutorial back when I very first started my Patreon on how I digitise my eyes in Photoshop. I think it's called making vector puppets. But you can see here that we've got our image. The first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the image is the right scale. So you can see here when I was in Photoshop, I wrote down this scale or the width that this image needs to be because my software has a nasty habit of importing my images in the wrong size. I don't know why it does that, but always double check that you are digitising to the right scale. Just makes things a bit easier. You don't have to fiddle with it later and you know it's going to be the right size. So I've got it showing my largest available hoop for my embroidery machine. It's just in my settings here. I can click on the type of hoop that I'm digitising in. This might be an option in your embroidery software. It just helps you give an idea to make sure what you're digitising isn't too big. But I won't be using this large hoop, I'm going to be using a smaller one, and I won't be doing the embroidery for that entire pattern piece. I'll just be doing the eyes, the nose and the mouth. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my stitch types. So here I have fill stitches in both satin and step, and I have outline stitches in satin and a straight stitch. And these are the main 4 stitches that I use the entire time that I'm digitising. I don't use the whole rest of the software, which is a bit of a shame, but they're more decorative stitches, things for quilting and things like that. So you can see in the bottom left it says outline, so I've clicked that I want to do an outline stitch, and I've gone the single stitch type, which is just a normal straight stitch. And what I'm doing is I'm just marking the points and making that straight stitch go all the way around my pattern, and this is going to be used for placement when I'm placing my embroidery pattern in the hoop. Sometimes when I'm doing larger pattern pieces, you need to make sure that when you're putting your fabric in the hoop, you're going to have enough fabric to cover that entire pattern piece. So what I like to do is I like to digitise this piece. I like to stitch it out when there's no fabric in the hoop. I do floating embroidery, so I just hoop my stabiliser, then use a spray adhesive and then stick my minky on the top. So before I stick the minky on the top, I'm going to do this straight stitch all the way around, or just at the front if my hoop is too small, and just stitch out so I have a guide of where to place my fabric later on. But we don't actually do this stitch on the fabric, it's just for lining that fabric up on top. So the first thing we're going to be digitising and the first thing we're going to be actually stitching onto our minky is going to be this nose and mouth. They're both going to be the same colour, and I want a solid stitch. So instead of outline, we're going to choose the fill stitch, and I'm just going to start by outlining the mouth and the nose. So in my particular software, you use both left and right clicks to place different sort of nodes. It's kind of like making a vector. So left click will give you a straight line and right click will give you a point that makes a curved line. And then you can go in with the edit tool, which is that little arrow pointing to a box in the tools in the left hand side. And I can use this to add more little points or nodes and drag them around until it's the correct shape. You can also see that there's the red cross and the green square, and that means where the stitching is going to start and end. So I'm just going to make sure that that is going to start at one side and end at the other. I don't want it stopping and starting in the middle, especially with satin stitches, because then you can get noticeable gaps. So another thing you can do is when you're clicking on a particular piece of embroidery, you can scale it or you can rotate it in this software. I usually don't use this very often unless I'm editing an existing piece of embroidery that I might be moving or scaling the eye or something like that to make it fit better. Now we want this nose and mouth to be satin stitch, not regular step stitch embroidery. So I select both of them, and down below where it had said fill stitch, I click on satin stitch and that converts it into satin stitching. Satin stitching gives a much thicker look to your embroidery, and I like to use it in things like the iris, strips like the mouth, little parts like the nose, or things like eyelashes. And you don't want to use it on very large broad areas, but anything that is sort of a strip or a band that you would like to sort of stand out and have a bit more pop, a bit more 3D and a bit more shine, because you're going to get the reflection of those stitches. That's when you want to go in and use satin stitch. It is a bit more delicate than your generic fill stitch, so I would only recommend it on plush that aren't going to be played a lot with by kids. So what I'm doing here is I'm clicking a little box down the bottom, which is the add angles feature, and you can see here that I'm dragging across one side to the other on the nose and the mouth where I've done the fill stitch, and this is controlling the angle of the fill stitch. So you want to make sure that you do this because you don't want your fill stitch going 2 inches across, from diagonally here from the bottom of the mouth to the top of the corner of the mouth. You want it to be going crossways. You never want your satin stitch to be too wide. I probably wouldn't ever go wider than maybe half an inch or 3/4 of an inch at the absolute maximum for a satin stitch, because there always is the chance that you could snap them or scratch them and they could break. So I would definitely recommend not going too wide. If you do very wide satin stitching, make sure that you put at least a couple of layers of your fray stopper, your sort of adhesive glue that is made for stopping fabric snapping, and that's going to really bake that in there and make sure that it's not as fragile as it was previously. So now I'm going in and I'm going in my fill stitch, and what we're going to do is we're going to digitize the whites of the eye first. We're not going to do the shines of the eye. I'm going to show you a special trick for that. We're not going to do that firstly. But you can see here I've actually selected yellow instead of white, because a lot of the backgrounds of the images I import in are white themselves, and white is harder to see in this software when you have the outline visible. So I usually digitize white as yellow. The colours that you select don't really matter as long as you know what they mean. So if I digitize her eye with a blue iris, I can always go and swap in a red colour or a pink or whatever colour I want if I'm going to make a character that's not rarity as I'm digitizing here. When I'm digitizing, I just use the standard fill stitch settings when I'm using the fill stitch. I don't really feel the need to play around with it very much. You can see the settings that I use here. You can see the width and the length of the stitches that it recommends, and that is just the default for my program, but feel free to copy that in your software. I just find that it gives a good result and I don't really need to play around with it too much. I also do most of my fill stitching at a 45-degree angle. I find that this, for some reason, reflects the light nicer. I don't know if there's an actual reason. I just like how it looks compared to a vertical or purely horizontal fill stitch. When you're digitizing a file, the most important thing to think of is what order you're going to be digitizing each color in. And what you need to remember is that light colors should never go on top of dark colors, because you will always see the dark color peeking through from underneath the light color. So if I was to digitize all of this and then plonk those eye shines, those white eye shines on the top, you would see that blue and that black peeking through underneath, and it's not a very good look. Here I'm just going through and I'm digitizing the blue. So I've started with my lightest colour and my largest colour, which is the fill stitch in white. The next step is going to be the iris. And one example of when you can actually do lighter colours on top of darker colours is when you're using a satin stitch, because satin stitches are so thick and so broad you don't actually see the colours that are underneath them. So it's very good if you're going over a line or something like that, or you need to cover up an area, you can use satin stitch because you won't see what's underneath a satin stitch. You could satin stitch a colour on top of black, and if your satin stitch is dense enough you won't be able to see what's underneath. So you can see here I'm going through and I'm just doing the shines in the iris, and what you want to do is you want to make sure that all your pieces are overlapping each other. So you can see here that the yellow, or what would be the white of the base of the eye, is being overlapped by this blue in the iris, and that's just because you don't want any gaps. If you have them too close, if they're not overlapping each other enough, you very often get gaps in your embroidery because of the stretch. You shouldn't have too many issues if you're using a cutaway thick stabilizer in your hoop and you're hooping properly, but it is good just in case not to give it the opportunity to mess up, so I like to give a generous overlap. So here I'm actually making my satin stitch denser, so instead of being a 0.4 I'm putting it at 0.3 millimeters for my satin spacing, and that is just going to make it just a little bit tighter. I find it gives a stronger satin stitch, so play around with your satin stitch density and try and get it quite dense, but if you go too dense you can end up snapping the thread and having issues there stitching it out. So I've gone in again, especially for my satin stitching, and selected that stitch angle tool, and I'm just making sure that the stitch is going to sort of gently warp around the iris, so sort of being horizontal at the top, vertical down the bottom, and curving it around so that that iris naturally sort of satin stitches around that natural shape, which makes it just a little bit prettier, and also makes sure that your satin stitches are at their minimum width, so you don't want them too long going on a diagonal trying to climb up the eye there. You can also see that I've overlapped each of these pieces of the iris to make sure that none of them have any gaps between them, just keeping in mind the order that you're going to be stitching them out and which bits are going to cover up what other bits. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to digitize the black of the eye, not the eyelashes, but just the black of the pupil. And we're going to do our eye shines after this, and I'll show you a nice little trick that my software can do that you might be able to translate into yours. So I'm just going in here with a step stitch. I only do satin stitching on my eyes usually in the iris if the iris is not too wide, and I'll do satin stitching in the eyelashes and eyebrows and things like that. The rest of it I'll just do the regular straight step stitch. Not very exciting, but you don't want to use too many satin stitches because again it makes it more frail, and also it can look a bit weird for larger areas. You want to just use your regular straight stitch for that. So here's my favourite part of this software. It's a tool called Remove Overlaps. So I've selected that black, and the black is currently the highest part of what we've digitized so far. So the black is on top of that blue, and by clicking that Remove Overlaps, it's going to cut out everything that's underneath it, just leaving that little bit of overlap underneath it, or underlap, I don't know what the right word is. It's just going to cut away any excess thread underneath it, so you have that blue just going under and you're not wasting excess thread. So now what we're going to do is now we're going to digitize our eye shines, and this is something that I picked up in this software with that Remove Overlaps tool, which is very handy and gives very neat looking eye shines. So I'm going to draw in those eye shines, but I'm going to make it just a little bit wider than they actually are. We're going to be using that Remove Overlaps tool, and the Remove Overlaps tool does not eat away everything that's underneath it. It eats away everything that's underneath it, but it leaves a couple of millimeters, just a smidgen around the outside. So we want to essentially poke a hole, cut out everything underneath these eye shines in the shape of those eye shines that you can see on the digitized or the drawn image that we're using as a reference. So you can see here that it's cut through the black, it's cut through the blue, and now we want to drag those eye shines back so they stitch out when that base white stitches out as well. And what this is going to do, so it's going to actually make the white of those eye shines a bit wider than it needs to be initially, but then when we come in with our blue and our black, it is going to stitch on top of that white around the edge, matching our original reference perfectly. So you're going to get a very crisp coverage of your white, so there's not going to be any darker colour showing up underneath our lighter colour, because our lighter colour is at the very bottom layer. So we've essentially punched out the shape of our eye shines there, and that's just a way that I find to make them very neat. It makes everything line up perfectly, and hopefully you can sort of copy that in your software, whether you do it manually by going in and manually drawing a hole in what you need to cut a hole in, but that's just how I like to do it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make her eyelid out of applique, because sometimes it's nice to do large areas out of fabric, out of minky when possible. I find that it's nice to do this for things like eyelids, things like cutie marks that are very large. any large area that you would think that would be made out of like fur or even skin if you're making a plush that has minky skin. I tend to not use minky applique for parts of the actual eye that would be wet and shiny because it looks a bit weird when it's furry like that. But all I've done is I've drawn a straight stitch all the way around where I want that, where I want the minky to be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm going to make it a different colour so it will stitch at a separate time to the original straight stitch. And then where it says single straight stitch down in this bottom left hand corner, I'm going to change it into a satin stitch. And you'll see on the right there in that red, boom, it just turned into a satin stitch. I can go in and set the width. I have a little guide that I've stitched out of all the different satin widths, so I can look at it and go, okay, I would like this line to be 0.08 inches wide, and that's roughly how wide I would like it to be. So you can see here that's going to cover up our initial straight stitch. The straight stitch is exactly in the middle of that satin stitch. You don't want to make your satin stitch too small because then it gets too difficult to actually trim the minky from around the outside. So I wouldn't make it too tiny unless you want to be extremely pedantic with trimming away any of that excess minky. So when we're stitching this out, what is going to happen is we've done the rest of our eye, then we're going to put in our blue thread. We're just going to stitch out that straight stitch outline. Then we're going to put down our piece of, say, blue minky in this case. Then we're going to do another straight stitch. So I've just copied and pasted another straight stitch outline, made it a different colour so it will stitch at a different time. So your first stitch will draw out where you need to put your fabric down. The second stitch will pin that fabric down. I would recommend going around twice with that particular stitch so it really holds that minky down. It's not going to fray and pop up and let that minky run loose. Then you're going to take your pair of scissors, you're going to trim all the way around right up to the edge of that straight stitch, and then you're going to put down something like a wash away film that's just going to hold your minky down neatly and out of the way while that satin stitch goes around and does that nice thick satin stitch line all the way around, and that's going to cover up both the edge of your minky and that straight stitch line that you put in there in the first place. The last thing that we're going to digitize is going to be the eyelashes and that eyebrow there. They're going to be in black and they're all going to be satin stitched. I like to use satin stitching for those sorts of things because it really gives it a 3D look compared to the flat nature of the base of the eye. So I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to select my fill stitch, and I'm going to just start off with a step stitch. I'll convert this all to satin stitches in a second, and I'm just going to trace around the edge of all of these. Now you really want to keep in mind what order you are digitizing these in. So you can see that my eyelashes down below, they overlap this piece, this eyebrow piece. So what I'm doing is I'm digitizing that eyebrow first, that will stitch out first, and then when I come in and stitch those eyelashes later, they will overlap and they will be on the top layer. So just keep in mind which bits do you want to stitch at the bottom of your layers and which do you want to be on the top. You can get some really cool looks by just varying when you stitch your eyelashes. You can have them layered on top of each other, so keep in mind which one do you want to be on the top, which one do you want to be on the bottom. So now I'm going in and I'm going to digitize all these eyelashes, and what I want to do is I want that, that main eyelash that separates the eyelid and the eye, the big thick one that runs horizontally, I want that to chop off and cover the bottom of these eyelashes. That's just how I like to do it. You could do that first and then have the eyelids popping out from the bottom and curling up, but I prefer to have that big thick horizontal line be the very last line that I stitch out. It's also very satisfying to watch it stitch out when you're doing it on the machine. So I haven't yet digitized the eyelashes that are on the right hand side of this eye that meet up with the eye white, because I wanted to talk about them specifically. Now I have done a bad job with my drawing here because I've scaled it, so I must have edited it after I initially did the digitizing, so the eyelashes are sort of floating away from the actual eye white, so I'm just going to eyeball them where I think they should be. What I like to do is I like to overlap them onto the eye white just a tiny bit. I'm only talking about 1 or 2 millimeters. This is because I usually find that you're going to get a little bit of separation. If you don't do that, you're going to get a bit of a gap between those black eyelashes and the white of the eye. So you can see here I'm just digitizing them, and then I'm going to grab all three of them and I'm going to move them left a little bit so they just overlap that white of the eye. You don't want to go too far because it can look a little bit silly if it's obvious that they're really cutting into the whites of that eye. You want that gap to be almost unnoticeable, but just enough that if there is a little bit of stretch and you have a little bit of warping, you're not going to have a gap between the white of the eye and those eyelashes. So just grabbing all of them, moving them to the side, and you can see that I get them to overlap that yellow line just the tiniest bit, and you will not be able to notice this unless I've told you this and you go back and maybe look at one of my plushes so close up. But usually I find that this makes them sit right on the edge of that eye white, and that's just something I like to make sure that they're not having any gaps between those two pieces. So now we have all of our eyelashes done, and the last thing we're going to do is we're going to convert them all into a satin stitch, because that's how I like to do my eyelashes. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to, like I did with the iris, I'm going to make the satin stitch a tiny bit denser. So I'm making about 25% more dense than the recommended satin stitch, because sometimes I find you can get tiny little gaps in what is recommended by my software, so I like to just make it a little bit tighter than that. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to put in the stitch angle for every single eyelash, which takes a fair while. Just making sure that it follows the natural curve of the eyelash. Don't put in too many lines to tell it what angle to do, because sometimes you can get a bit confused if you went in on a single eyelash and put in 10 lines of the angle you want it to be. It can be a bit too much for it to deal with, so I only like to put maybe 3 or so, you know, even maybe 1 on a straighter kind of eyelash, just making sure that it follows the natural curve of that eyebrow, the eyelid and the eyelashes, and just making sure that you are doing the sort of narrowest possible satin stitch at all times if you can. That just makes it a little bit stronger, makes them nice and thick and dense, and you're not going to have any issues with your satin stitch being too long and potentially showing gaps or coming apart. So just to make sure I don't have to switch my thread colour too many times, I'm going to go in and I'm going to get the black that is in the pupil, and I'm going to make sure that that stitch is just before the black of the eyelashes. And it's going to stitch this part first, and then it's going to stitch the eyelashes on top. So make sure you get that order correct, but I just didn't want to have to change into that black thread twice. Now I'm going to delete my reference image from underneath, and I'm just going to examine the file. I can go into something called the art canvas, which is included in this software. It's quite useless in my opinion because it really distorts the look of the stitches. Kind of gives you an idea of how they're going to look, but it makes the satin stitches all funky. I don't really use it very often. I usually know I can spot errors in my own digitising before I actually stitch it out. So we're going to go through the different layers. First we have the straight stitch, and this is going to help us place our piece in the hoop and make sure that we have enough fabric to cover the piece that we're stitching onto. We're going to stitch out this straight stitch before we put the fabric into the hoop, and this is just a reference for where we're going to place our fabric in the hoop. The next thing that I digitised was the nose and mouth. You could put this last if you want to, I just wanted to show you guys this first for some reason. And you can see that it's in a satin stitch, and what I did was I made sure that the satin stitch started and ended at one end of the nose and the mouth. I made the satin stitch more dense, and I also put in the angles that I wanted that satin stitch to be. The next layer that's going to stitch out is my largest and lightest layer, and that is the white layer that I've digitised in yellow just to make it a little bit easier to see. We want to put this white fill stitch at the bottom, because if we put it on the top of anything, it's going to show whatever's underneath it. So I like to do that first. It's also good to get the largest area of stitching out of the way first. I find it has less issues with the fabric stretching or warping if you do that large area first. The next thing that I digitised was the iris and the two colours within the iris of the little iris shines. I did this all in satin stitching. Again, I made it a little bit denser to suit my personal taste, and I also put in those stitch angles to make sure that it curved around that iris in a nice natural way. I also made sure that depending on what order these different colours in the iris stitched out, they each overlapped the previous one, just to make sure that there wasn't going to be any gaps. The next section I did was the large area above the eye in the eyelid, and I did this in applique just to show you guys something a little bit different. I started out by outlining what I want to be in Minky in a straight stitch, and I ended up putting one straight stitch down to show us where the Minky needs to go, one where we're going to cut out the Minky, and one again to sort of tack that Minky down and make sure it's not going to go anywhere. Then we're going to go around and convert one of those straight stitches into a satin stitch outline, and that is going to run a satin stitch all the way around and seal at the edge of our Minky and do that lovely applique satin stitching. The last part that I digitized was all the black areas, so I did the black of the pupil, and I also did all of the eyelashes, and I did those in a satin stitch, the same as my other satin stitches, changing the angle, the density, and keeping in mind what order I wanted them to stitch out so that the eyelashes overlapped what areas I wanted them to overlap. Now when I've finished with doing my piece of digitizing, I'm just going to save that out in whatever kind of file format I need it to be in. So I'm going to choose the format that my machine takes, so I'm just using the little drop down menu here, and I'm just going to go Benina USB, which is .exp, and I'm going to save out that embroidery file onto my USB, and then I can take it over to my machine and stitch it out. If you want to check out more on how I do my embroidery, I have lots of other tutorials on how to do the actual embroidery itself in the hoop, how to do things like 3D eyelashes, how to do applique manually, how to do embroidery over pieces of applique. So if you are doing a piece of embroidery over a marking in the actual fabric. I also have tutorials on doing floating embroidery, which is where you don't actually hoop the Minky, you just hoop your stabilizer and then you float your Minky on top with a layer of adhesive, which is how I do all of my embroidery. So if you ever have any questions about any of my videos, please send me a message. I'm on the computer almost all the time and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as I can. I hope you guys learned some tips and tricks about digitizing your own embroidery files, and I hope that you can apply them onto your types of embroidery software. Good luck with all your embroidery, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!